Just
It
takes
says you're streaming live on YouTube. It's up on the top left-hand corner of the screen there.
Oh, okay. We're now live. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you, Bernard. Good evening. My name is John. I'm with Broadsheet. This is Tomorrow Tonight. We're very honoured to be joined by the editor of the London-based The Irish World, Bernard Purcell. Good evening, Bernard.
Good evening, John. Always a pleasure.
Always a great pleasure to have you. We have a Hitchcock kind of rear window shot of your background.
I thought for the one or two people who are up watching this that they might like something other than the curtains. Just
okay. Well, if there's any movement behind you, any incidents going on, we'll inform you.
Yeah, they might see snow.
Well, yeah. Well, tell me, you said it's -6 there.
-6, and then in parts of England and Scotland, it's going to be -16. It's expected to reach -9 in some parts around here.
-9. Oh my God. But no snow there yet.
We've had snow. It just isn't settling. The streets have been white in the morning and then it becomes sludge. But I've got friends in Massachusetts who would scoff, and in New England who would just be utterly derisory at what we consider snow, or when the airports stop for just something like a millimetre. Anyway, shall we get to the papers?
Yeah, I actually wanted to get to The Irish World first.
Okay.
If that's okay, which is out.
It comes out across the UK, digitally on Tuesday, in the newsagents and supermarkets on Wednesdays, and makes its way across to Ireland on Thursdays. And it usually has Saturday's cover date on it. It goes to press Tuesday, overnight on Tuesday. The story we've got this week is an obvious one, because we find ourselves scratching our heads. We can understand some of the nuance, some of the sensitivities, but we've never fully understood why, because of the common travel area, there are no restrictions on people traveling between traveling from Ireland to Britain. I can understand why they might be worried about say some political ramifications. But given that it's quite clear traveling from Britain to Ireland, there are at least officially restrictions in place, even if though they're often more honoured in the breach than in the observance, that they don't tally. It's, I think, germane, or it's certainly relevant at the moment, not least because the British government today, as you'll see from all the front pages, has emphasised that it's introducing the possibility of a 10-year sentence for people who try to use a COVID backdoor. And at the moment, there's no reference, despite going to these rather elaborate and open to criticism measures, there does not seem to have been any recognition of the fact that people do appear to be coming through what is the Dublin corridor. And at the same time, I mean, the government admits that it can't do anything about people travelling the border because they're not sharing data. Now, I suppose if they really wanted to get down to it, they could share the information, as Simon Coveney says in that interview he gave in Ireland that we picked up. And in the same interview, we also, from I think it was Virgin TV, we picked up on Micheál Martin's comments that in hindsight, he would not have lessened the restrictions for Christmas, which is something that people here can't imagine this government admitting to or saying, even though they probably would get a much more forgiving response than the official inquiry when it comes will in its ruling.
Okay, just quickly, calls to share UK vaccine surplus with Ireland.
It's anticipated. Well, that's from a chap who is the Director of Public Health in Belfast, and he's now at one of the major epidemiological centres here in London. He said that there is a common sense case. I mean, Mary Lou McDonald for Sinn Féin was asked about it on Sky and went from kind of, well, it's the right thing to do, etc. But didn't actually go into the strategic rationale of it. But I think it was Professor Raphael, he said that it's enlightened self-interest because you have a shared travel area. You want to minimize the occurrence. You want to minimize the spread of the virus. So I mean, if you look at the interchange and the travel between the islands, it makes sense to do that. And it has been hinted at that because the British government has taken a punt, it got in early and bought pre-ordered vaccines, various vaccines, different ones, some of, I think maybe 5, possibly 6, 3 of which have official approval. It will have more than it needs eventually, even if it does go for the proper 2 doses as recommended. So it's an argument spread it that way. At the same time, though, we also mentioned in the paper that anyone who's 70, and we have a lot of older readers who hasn't had the vaccination, doesn't have to sit there waiting for the phone or for the letter. They can contact their GP, or they can contact a hotline or somebody who has particular risk conditions, and they're ahead of schedule in that regard.
Okay, the Irish Examiner, Michal Varadkar, cautious reopening in April to June, says Taoiseach, and apparently March the 5th for a number of essential services or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, we're not even talking about history, we're talking about the last 12 months. To actually forget the lessons of history is to repeat them. Trying to name a deadline has got us over here into so much difficulty on at least 3 occasions with the world's worst death rate. And certainly on a number of occasions, one would think that senior politicians, and it does appear that the Taoiseach has fallen into this category a couple of times, they feel they have to throw this meat to the media that yes, there will be a date. The reality is nobody can tell. There are so many interconnected factors. Nobody can give a deadline or a precise date. You can give and it's a mistake to be drawn into it, because we've seen it at the press conferences in Downing Street here as well. And we've seen people like Matt Hancock, the health secretary, resist it. Jonathan Van Tam, the English health advisor, or the health advisor for England, public health advisor, also say, look, when he's asked about holidays, the more complicated or the more moving parts there is, the harder it is going to be to predict. And we've even seen whether or not it will remain the case. We've seen somewhat more temperate or cautious language from Boris Johnson, who couldn't resist saying that he would save Christmas, that people would have their summer holidays, and we saw the consequences of that, again, with the death toll we have. It's been described as an optimism bias that has been one of the things that has hurt led to a confused and sometimes contradictory and conflicting response by the government here. And it's something that the Irish government should learn from here if they have any sense.
Yeah, I think hopium is the term, isn't it? Children's Hospital may not be ready until 2024. I'd say that's very optimistic myself.
We've no expertise on that, but the sheer sums involved in that just staggered me. I remember as a young reporter having to, I think it was because people wanted to break a bit of a deadlock, I had to go to Beaumont Hospital, which for a couple of years was fully built, had the operating suites and everything, and had a full staff, but no doctors. The reason it couldn't open was because the consultants wanted to go ahead on their private clinic, but it was uncannily like an episode out of Yes Minister, and that was back in the early 80s. There are all sorts of considerations. Like you would think it's a straightforward enough matter, but this one seems to be a big black hole for public funds.
Yeah, and as you say, just untold amounts of money every day just going into this enormous building site. Nothing really to show for it as yet, anyway. This is an RT Investigates documentary this evening from Tallaght Hospital.
Yes, all the broadcasters are actually. There's now enough footage, and there's this sense that we're coming to at least one of the final straits of the pandemic. So people are looking back. What are the lessons learned, or just showing the reality of people behind the scenes as well. In part, it's public interest broadcasting because you have the rather absurd naysayers or deniers out there, and then you've got people turning up for work and looking at death all around them. So you can see why it's in the interests to try and at least get it home to people the seriousness of this infection. It's an opportunist infection. It's killing a lot of people, and people are making up.
I think, I certainly don't think they're denied any coverage of that. I mean, there seems to be wall-to-wall coverage of.
It can be easy coverage as well for a broadcaster, or for sometimes to give something dramatic. Not supposed to say that as a journalist.
No, well, it's a lot of fear, fear being whipped up anyway. Teens secretly filmed. This is.
I have no. I saw the page. I saw it.
It's just I mentioned it because the man can't be named because of this GDPR ruling that has affected murder. Murder is.
And isn't Michael McDowell doing something about that?
Well, McDowell and O'Callaghan have supplied potential bills, according to Derek, and the McDowell one, I think is going to go ahead. But we've had like 2 months of this. It's very unusual. As one of the deterrents of this kind of crime is.
Well, GDPR, you will find people will often cite rules and regulations and red tape as a reason for not doing things. But if there's sufficient will, one can always just find the right frame of mind, and you go around it. You don't have to break the rules. You don't have to break the law. You can actually just reframe it.
Well, it needs to be done pretty quickly because these court cases are coming up every day now.
Well, legislation in a hurry often makes for. If you look, for instance, back over here, in the 70s and throughout the 80s, we had the Prevention of Terrorism Act, which was rushed through in less than 48 hours, and we had something like 40 years of the consequences of it. So it's best to get it right.
Yeah, repent at leisure. Daily Telegraph, 10 years in jail for holidaymakers who lie about going to Portugal.
Yes, that's pretty much, that dominates all the front pages over here today. The FT and others, and it's. I'm not a betting man, but I would be prepared to take a bet with anybody that nobody will serve a 10-year sentence for this. And,
of course, but
and they're threatening 10-year sentences and restrictions and quarantine a year after the pandemic started. When the health advice, which does change, was these are very, very effective, as we've seen in Taiwan and Australia and New Zealand, when there's negligible or emergent rates of infection in a country. But when you have levels as high as we have, it's questionable what kind of impact something like this will have so late out the gate. I mean, it's something that does need to be done, but the phrase stable door springs to mind on it, certainly.
Do you agree with this?
I think it needs to be thought through. It needs to be comprehended. They seem to have rushed this through. They seem to want it in the headlines. What's interesting is that the hotels involved are getting, I think, 30 quid and 20 quid, possibly 50 quid in all for something that will cost the holidaymakers who return nearly £1,800. So people are still trying to work out, well, how have they worked out these figures? At the same time, you've already seen from that Telegraph story that you just showed that the libertarian tendency within the Conservative Party is already railing against this as totalitarianism. While the Labour Party here is saying that it's not enough, you need to actually be much more sweeping. So it seems like it's more directed for headlines than any kind of effective action.
But isn't that most unusual? I mean, you describe them as libertarians. You don't really have to be much of a libertarian to regard that as pretty extreme stuff. And
no, but I was describing a part of the Conservative Party that has been resistant to lockdown, that has been resistant to restrictions, some of them even resistant to masks, this will immediately be like a red rag to them. And we have seen that this party has not pandered to them up to now, and has tended to run shy from any kind of opposition that they've got from their own ranks.
Well, I would imagine if you were a Conservative Party member that this would go against everything you stood for, really. I mean, and in terms of Britain, we were talking about the spirit, the indomitable spirit of the London.
Well, it's a big country. There's outside London as well. Yes,
Well,
I take your point on that, but you have to keep one of the probably most valid criticisms of it is that it seems to be piecemeal. I mean, you already seen in Ireland, and we had it in our story there that we picked up from reports over that there are some people who will just assume that's the cost. You add the 500 euro, the cost of a fine of going to the airport, or the cost of going across the border, the 80 euro. There will be people who will write that off as part of the cost of their holiday. It will exclude a lot of others. Whereas you are much better looking for a consensus and the kind of the blitz spirit, get people all pulling together. What has already been said is that this will, even letting the debate focus on holidays and at a time where is losing control of the debate, and you're actually opening yourself to arguments that, well, this just means that the travel from so-called hotspots is only going to be the preserve of the very rich. There is no way that this government is prepared. I mean, especially if you look at the front pages today, to really stand over somebody taking a 10-year sentence, which already I think the Telegraph and the Star and others have said is more than, go for the most emotive example, they say child abusers will get, or serious villains.
Incredible.
But it is attention grabbing, and that's pretty much what drives a lot of the government's responses. But they might have something more substantive down the road, but it does tend to think in headlines.
Well, presumably just it'll deter 90% of people from...
If it does that, it will work. Then you work on the numbers, and if you can actually go a little bit further than, say, nudge theory and shape and modify behavior, yes. But I think anyone who looks at Heathrow, you can see that there's still a lot of people coming through, that nobody's really focused on what the obligations of the airports are, or of some of the airlines. We've already seen Ryanair and I think one of the other budget airlines say that they have no intention whatsoever of insisting on vaccination certificates for travellers. So,
and then you have Qantas who will do the opposite. I mean, we are a grandmother again. Princess Eugenie has a baby son. The Morning Star: women victims of Tory's COVID crisis response. Pandemic. That's
actually an interesting report from the Commons, from the Women and Equalities Committee. It's essentially said that the pandemic has reinforced a lot of the inequalities that were pre-existing in society. That income, say women, the ability to work, look after kids, just the unequal nature has been really brought into stark relief, which a lot of people have found through this pandemic. There will be some interesting, I think, financial and economic treaties or dissertations that'll come out of it, because I think there were some figures published the other day which showed that the loss of income of most people was in the trillions, say ordinary working people, whereas the accrued additional income of the world's richest billionaires was that figure plus a third of a trillion. So I think it was 1.7 trillion versus lost income versus 1.9 trillion enhanced wealth for the world's richest. And that's already causing people to maybe rethink. It may not be enough, but it's causing people to actually look at. I don't want to sound like a raving Bolshevik or anything like that, but it's ironic that papers like the FT are the ones that are critiquing capitalism much more so than others you might expect.
Well, it's not really capitalism, is it? I mean, if it works like this...
Yes, you're quite right. You're an Adam Smith devotee, obviously.
Well, I was. Not so much anymore. 10 days in a hotel room, or it's 10 years in a cell if you lie. Fear ratcheting up the fear there. The London
Well,
Review.
there's a matte cartoon which shows on the Telegraph, which I don't think it's on the front page there. I saw it earlier this evening, and it's two blokes in the scrubs in a cell, and so I'm in here for coming from Portugal. I'm in here for 5 days in South Africa. So comparing their war stories on the whole, and ridicule is usually the first chink or first crack that happens in the policy.
Yeah, are we on the red zone then in terms of Britain?
Anyone at the moment, as of earlier today that I checked, despite what there were some pretty high rolling 14-day figures, but there are no restrictions for people coming from, that's hence our front page story, coming from Ireland into Britain, and I think it's Channel Islands as well, because of the common travel area. There are no restrictions. That's why some people have been coming from Dubai, some people have been coming from Portugal into Dublin and across to here.
What makes Portugal a red zone as opposed to Ireland being a red zone? I mean, what makes us not a red zone?
It's infection rates.
Okay, but weren't ours terrible?
Well, if you recall, we began this conversation by my saying we've been scratching our heads trying to work out what the calculation is on the common travel area.
I beg your pardon. Sorry, I didn't mean to go back and to circle back as the.
No, I'm saying I don't have the answer. I mean,
yes, I know. Sorry for circling back though to it. We've left the best for last, of course. The UK Star, which never disappoints, or never. This is Piers Morgan for PM. I don't know if you can see that.
This might best be described as a reader engagement exercise.
Okay. You're not going to. The Irish World won't be joining the campaign to have PM for PM, no?
You asked me about this before, and I did say he would at least have to find a safe seat, and he'd have to take a pay cut.
Change of underpants as well, I think, badly. Bernard, how are things generally for you there at the moment?
Sure, like everyone else, we're getting on with it. There are people who've had a very, very rough time. There are people, who've, but for the most part, people are just keeping their head down and doing their best. I mean, I was talking to someone the other day who said, "Look, I'm alive," and they were talking about themselves. So there are people for whom it's somewhat unreal. We've had, even on that street out there, there's a gentleman across the road who is in his 70s. He's in the hospital with COVID. There's been deaths within a couple of, within a square mile. So it's pretty pervasive.
Yeah, and when you go out to the shops and the like, I mean, are people chatting? Is it just sort of grim masks?
No, people do. People, absolutely. You'll see. There's an awful lot of lockdown dogs, and I know that you have an interest in dogs, and some quite stupid owners as well. Yeah. But they're out, and there's kids who are out playing. There's lessons happening. Some are going to school because their parents are key workers. You see far more children and their parents, or at least their adult carers, out with them on the commons in the park and places like that. You see, people adapt. They always adapt, and they're pragmatic.
Would most people be masked, Bernard?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. So even on the street now.
Even on the street, okay. Yeah. About like a 99%. It'd be very unusual to see somebody without a mask.
Well, the requirement is to wear them in shops and inside, or when you're talking to somebody. So it's not like in Spain or where you have to wear it on the street or in the States. But you are seeing people. You see an awful lot of black and minority ethnic, which are the BANE, so Black Asian minority ethnic.
Yeah, horrible term.
Yes, and technically, when we deal with authorities here, Irish are included in there.
Really?
Yes, but given the very, very high incidence rate of COVID amongst, and I'm not trying to use a label for people, but you will certainly see that that awareness is definitely among people who are statistically deemed to have a predisposition, or at least to be vulnerable. You see it amongst older people; they'll wear the masks. So it is there. You will see there will always be the people who will be defiant. There was an interesting case the other day of some youngster who tried to buy alcohol in a local supermarket, and the person, they said, in the shop said, "I can't sell it to you. You're not wearing a mask." It's, I'm 16. I'm exempt. So.
Oh, I meant to very briefly. In April, they said they were going to open the pubs with no alcohol in Britain.
And the swimming pools without water.
Yeah, okay. On that bombshell. Thanks, Bernard. Thank you very much. Hopefully see you next week.
Absolutely, John.
And the Irish World is on sale at the moment, and will be on sale